All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Jeff Thompson. I'm a detective with the NYPD. I'm also an adjunct associate research scientist with Columbia University Department of Psychiatry. And what this symposium is all about is bringing together expert researchers in the world of awe, the science of awe, and then utilizing that information to implement it into practical use and purpose. And that's the whole idea of bringing academia together with practitioners and professionals. It's not one or the other, it's both. And realizing that this event was primarily created for first responders and frontline workers, however, open to the general public as well. Positive mental health is something everybody deserves. Every single human being on this planet, especially what I say is my brothers and sisters in law enforcement, first responders, and those frontline workers. And I think this year alone has demonstrated how we all just need to look after ourselves. And especially if your role in life involves helping and protecting others, it's got to start with you first. And that's not selfish, that's smart. So as we get into day two here, again, I want to welcome everybody. We've got some amazing speakers. Starting this morning with David and Craig, and I'm really looking forward to what they both have to say. We're going to start off with David first, and David's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He's also doing some great collaborative work at UPenn as well, and there's links to his stuff on the webpage. Again, take a look at it, but don't do it now because you're going to get to hear him speak first. So you can check the links later. They're always going to be there. This is a great opportunity, though, to hear him. And David, thanks so much, man. And I'm going to share it. Turn it over to you, brother.
All right, great. Jeff, will you tell me when I only have 5 minutes left?
Certainly.
All right, great. And thank you, Jeff, so much for having me. And to all of you listening, it's a real honor to present some of this work to you all. As Jeff said, this year in particular, I am in awe of what first responders have done this year and every year. My wife's a medical doctor, so she was on the front lines. And as I'll share, my father was a first responder as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about awe. I know you've heard a lot about awe. I'm going to go into some of its components that you may not have heard about before, how we measure it, and how it fits with other positive, impactful experiences. But let's start with a few examples. You've probably seen this before in some other presentations. It's a classic awe-inspiring scene. And in the chat, just pop a yes in there if you've seen this particular scene before, if you've ever been down to the Grand Canyon. Another way that people access awe is artwork. This particular painting was in the Philadelphia Art Museum for a little while, but really any local art museum. Not everything's for everyone, but usually you can find something that will stop you in your tracks. But art is another common source of awe. And then pop a yes in the chat if you've seen this. This is a picture of a black hole that was taken last year. I saw this on social media, and this, this totally stopped me from scrolling, and I was absolutely amazed that what's possible through science today. I wish that people shared this kind of material on social media more rather than the other stuff that people put out there. Now here's a quintessential awe moment. Only 500 or 600 human beings have ever been up to high Earth orbit and able to see the Earth as a whole. Astronauts refer to this as the overview effect, and they say that it's life-changing, seeing not only the beauty and the grandeur of Earth, as well as the vastness and blackness of space that we're floating through, but also the preciousness of our planet and the fact that we're all in this together. Here's the great city of New York. I think it's an awe-inspiring skyline. I'm sure many of you have seen this many times. Now, these are all pretty typical awe-inspiring images, right? And it probably may not have occurred to you that awe happens in our daily life, and it can happen on the job as well. And so my father was a firefighter, and maybe if we were having a drink or two after a few minutes, or maybe an hour or so, every now and again, I'd start talking to him about what it's like to be in a building on fire. And it was interesting what he chose to talk about to me. I'm sure there's all kinds of things he could have talked about, but when I was younger, he would talk about how it felt to turn over and to look up at the ceiling of a fully involved fire and to see the fire rolling across the ceiling. And I'm sure there's a lot of things he was feeling in those moments. But one of the things he chose to focus on, at least in our conversations, was the awe that he felt. He said it was the most beautiful thing that he's ever seen. I think that had a big impact on me personally. And so I want to turn this over to you all. If you could just close your eyes for a moment and take a nice deep breath in, and just let whatever moment from your work that you felt awe come to you. Doesn't need to be the biggest moment, doesn't need to be anything particularly dramatic, but some moment where on the job you felt this feeling of awe overwhelm you. So just let your mind bring something up and just notice how you felt in your body. Notice what happened in your mind, your thoughts, how you felt afterwards. Take another nice deep breath in. And you can open your eyes as you let that breath out. Now, I wish that we could hear from some people, but we don't have the time for it. But if you're interested in sharing your story, you can go to this website, varietiescorpus.com, and you can write about your experience, and actually it will help our research. So that if that's of interest, we'd love to hear from you. I'm sure you've seen this definition a number of times, but just we always like to define our terms here. So we call awe a perception of vastness, and that vastness can be perceptual, like seeing the Grand Canyon, a lot of space, or it can be conceptual, like seeing an astronaut seeing Earth from orbit and realizing that everything we care about is on this one little ball floating in space. And then the need for accommodation is to somehow understand or care about the experience, right? So you might feel awe as you first take off in an airplane, but after an hour or so, you don't really care about the window, looking out the window anymore. You're going to flip on that television. So this need for accommodation is mentally processing that perception of vastness. Now, I think awe falls along a continuum of other experiences in terms of how connected we feel to others during moments of awe. So moments like flow, where we feel our sense of self and time go away. Mindfulness, you may have taken a mindfulness meditation training, when we feel deep feelings of love for friends and family. And then awe sits right between these kinds of experiences that you feel on a more of an everyday kind of basis to peak and mystical type experience. Now at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, I study using psychedelic substances to treat depression and addiction. You may have heard about this on the news recently. And it seems like what's the therapeutic aspect of these substances is their ability to sometimes create mystical experiences. So I think awe falls along this continuum. It doesn't happen every day, it may not happen every week, but it's more common than these rare once in a lifetime experiences, but it's at least still a little uncommon. I'm going to talk to you about a study where we ask people to do exactly what I asked you to do. We ask people to think about a moment of awe. All right. And we asked about 500 people. In this case, this is one study of many. We've actually asked tens of thousands of people at this point. Now, here are some examples that we get when we just ask people to report moments of awe. Now, I asked you to think of one that occurred on the job. This is just any moment of awe. So here's someone talking about a view of the lake during a winter holiday. And, pretty common stimulus, but you see some useful descriptors here. My jaw dropped, jaw-droppingly beautiful a couple of times. My eyes lit up, face was grinning from joy, relief. So here are some clues about how we might measure awe, which we'll go into in a moment. Here's more of that conceptual vastness. So hearing Elon Musk talk about sending humans to Mars, right? This is kind of a mind-blowing idea in terms of the vastness involved. And then lastly, kind of sweet story about a guy talking about his honeymoon with his wife and seeing these massive Rocky Mountains. So what we do as psychologists, we read thousands and thousands of descriptions like this, and what we pull out are these individual questions. We make a whole bunch of these questions, hundreds of them actually, and they look very much like this. So as I go through a few of these questions, I want you to choose for that moment of awe that you thought of. I want you to choose which of these fits that moment of awe. So did you sense things momentarily slow down? Okay, try to think of your answer. Did you feel small compared to everything else? Did you feel closely connected to humanity? I know I'm going quick, but so you have to just go with your gut, whatever your first response is. Experience something greater than myself.
Hey, David, just heads up, just under 5 minutes.
Okay, great. We're on track here. Felt my jaw drop and struggled to take in all I was experiencing at once. So once we have the answer to hundreds of these questions, we do something called factor analysis, which involves a lot of complex matrix algebra that luckily we don't have to go into. And computer programs are able to do a lot of this work now. And what we result in is 6 different clusters. So these are kind of sub-scales, what we call them, of awe, or they're sub-factors of awe. So time changing, feeling of the self gets smaller, feeling a sense of connectedness to other people, that vastness, which is part of the definition, physical changes like jaw dropping, eyes widening, and accommodation, which is also part of the definition. Now, if you go to scottbarrykaufman.com awe experience scale, you can take this measure, you could just Google it, and you can write about your experience and actually take this scale. We also found here some of the triggers for awe. So for most people, it's beauty, scenery or artwork, right? But also ability of our fellow human beings and the virtue of our fellow human beings. For some people, it's religious or spiritual. And then for some people, it's threat. It could be a thunderstorm or a natural disaster of some kind even. So negative triggers can actually trigger awe as well. And here's some more granular kind of look at some of these triggers for awe. Natural scenery seems like the quickest and easiest way to get there. But other people, interpersonal awe. You may hear my colleague Mariana Graziosi talk a little bit about interpersonal awe. Awe from other people, loved ones, coworkers, colleagues. And then you see monuments, art, music. Awe is ambivalent. It's a little bit negative, but it's mostly positive. So that makes it an interesting emotion. I'm glad there's a whole symposium organized by Jeff about awe, because I think it's so interesting to learn about. At least I think so. Other research, as you've probably seen from my other colleagues, Dacher Keltner, and many others doing great work on this. Pretty consistent finding. You experience more awe. It's associated with overall happiness, well-being, health. Extremely important for the difficult job you all do, and also causes pro-social behavior. I mean, helping people all the time is very difficult. People talk about compassion fatigue and burnout. There seems to be something about awe where when you feel awe, you have this kind of impulse where you want to help other people around you, and that could kind of refill the well, so to speak, or provide some kind of refreshment for that impulse to help others. Now, a lot more research needs to be done on how to intervene on providing people with more awe and if it's all that effective. But these are correlations that are very intriguing to follow up on, I think. And there's been at least some experimental work suggesting that you can cause more happiness, well-being, and pro-social behavior in people. So I know I'm running out of time here, and I want to make sure I have a chance to answer your questions. But basically, some takeaways: awe can be measured. It has those 6 components, which I think are very interesting psychological categories, and you can take these tests online, very easy to do. Importantly, and probably the reason why you're here, is experiencing more awe is indeed associated with well-being, happiness, health, and pro-social behavior. And there's lots of sources of awe: natural scenery, virtue, other people, mastery, art, science. It's all around us if we take the time to look. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it. And thanks again, Jeff.
Yeah, no, of course, David, thanks. I'm sure I wasn't the only one trying to snap some photos. I hadn't seen about more than half of those too, so thanks. As a guy that's trying to collect as much awe as I can, now I have some new ones to my collection, so thanks very much. And yeah, it's honestly, it's fascinating. And then writing down those 6 aspects, I'm sure I invite everybody else to. I hope you took photos. This will all be archived, so you can pause it and write them down, because sometimes it moved fast. But yeah, this is fantastic. And Craig, there's a lot of pressure on you right now, man. I don't know if you realized it or not. But in all seriousness, let me turn it over to you, Craig. David, thank you again. And Craig Anderson is another phenomenal researcher in the world of awe, and just incredible work that you've been doing. Craig is a postdoctoral research scholar in marketing at the Olin Business School at Washington University in St. Louis. And he's going to share with you some of the amazing stuff that he's been doing. And under his title is Awe in Nature Heals, and just overall awe in the outdoors. And I'm certain this people are going to find this some of your work incredibly, well, all of your work incredibly fascinating. So I'll just stop there and turn it over to you. Thanks, Craig.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to David for laying kind of all that important definitional work. So the theme of today's session, let's get these slides going. All right, is from research to real life. So I'm going to be talking about awe in real life. And if you tuned in yesterday, you heard from a lot of amazing researchers about how awe can promote well-being and resilience. And on our theme of research to real life, I'm going to add this link to it here and make a case for how awe can help us understand why being in nature and partaking in outdoors recreation can have benefits for us. The evidence that I have that awe in nature heals comes from a 3-year study that I did as a graduate student at UC Berkeley in the psychology department. And the goal of that study was to build out the scientific case for outdoors recreation as evidence-based method of increasing health and well-being. And in pursuit of that goal, we studied people who went whitewater rafting. It's kind of a unique research context. So we studied military veterans, first-line responders, and also youth from underserved communities who went on whitewater rafting trips between 1-day and 5-day trips. And then we followed up with them over time to see what about that experience of whitewater rafting, predicted improvements in well-being and resilience over time. Now, this, I think, is appropriate for a real-world session on a couple different levels. So this was definitely real world for us researchers. So me and my research team of undergraduates, we were on every single whitewater rafting trip that happened. We were out on the boats. We got thrown into the water and the rapids. Grad students talk about, metaphorical blood, sweat, and tears. I have literally bled trying to collect this data from being thrown out of boats in the rapids and whatnot. So it was real for us. And it was also real from the standpoint of seeing the effect that the awe and being in the outdoors had on our participants. And to kind of help illustrate that, I have a photo that is awe-inspiring to me. This was one of the highlights of my graduate school career. This was a 5-day trip that I took with participants in our study. And in addition to military veterans, we had first-line responders that responded to the Pentagon on 9/11. And this was the 15-year anniversary. And I'm sort of reliving some of these experiences as I'm describing it to you, feeling awe and feeling a little emotional. But seeing this effect that, this experience had on people, that was really real for me. So it was an honor, to do this research. And I'm happy to be here to share it with you today. So colloquially, we refer to this project as the Great Outdoors Lab Project. And as I mentioned, the goal was to help build out the scientific case for outdoors recreation as evidence-based method of increasing health and well-being. And I'm going to just kind of show you the methods, an overview before I start digging into some findings. So as I mentioned, our participants were military veterans and first responders, and also youth from underserved communities, all populations that we know are at risk for stress and other sort of challenges. We collected a lot of data during the rafting trips. We really wanted to sort of get into that experience. So we collected survey data, right? So kind of paper and pencil before and after on those days of rafting. We also collected saliva. So you can imagine me chasing people around collecting saliva at the put-in and the takeouts. It was kind of chaotic. And then we also collected behavioral data. So I devised kind of a suction cup mount setup for GoPro cameras. And we had them on the front of all of our rafts looking back at the participants. So we could look at, the behaviors, the emotion expressions that people showed during the rafting trip. So this is all the data we collected during the rafting trips. And then some key measures, of resilience and well-being. So before, we collected this before the rafting trips and then 2 weeks after the rafting trips had ended. And these measures included PTSD symptoms, stress levels, satisfaction with life, kind of social well-being is the extent that people feel like, they're connected to the communities that they're in and they feel supported. And then, of course, just happiness. And again, I'm showing you kind of the overarching method to our madness here. And then next, we're going to drill down into a couple sets of findings. And I have 2 objectives for the short time that I have with you today. The first is to demonstrate how awe helps us explain why nature is good for us. And the second is to demonstrate the contagious nature of emotions. And we'll begin with the first one. Now, the idea that nature experience is good for us is not a new idea, right? This has been around for a long time. Here in the United States, John Muir was really important in recognizing this and helped founding the national park system. But from a scientific perspective, kind of an unanswered question is, why is nature good for us? And my work looks at awe as a potential mechanism that explains why being in the outdoors is good for us. So in order to demonstrate this, the first step is, showing the benefits of the outdoors. So you'll recall these 5 different measures that we collected. Remember, we measured that before the rafting trip started and then 2 weeks after the rafting trip. So we let a decent amount of time pass by to see if there were any changes. And across the board, we found significant changes. And really most notable was PTSD symptoms. We saw 29% lower PTSD symptoms, things like hypervigilance, trouble sleeping, right? That was 29% lower 2 weeks after the rafting trip. And kind of a remarkable and maybe, heartbreaking fact we found in our data was that the youth from these underserved communities in Oakland and Richmond, they had higher PTSD symptoms than our veterans and our first line responders. But across the board, we found significant improvements in all of these aspects of well-being and resilience. Next, we tested if the emotional experiences people had during the rafting trips predicted these changes. So you'll remember I mentioned survey data we collected during the trips. We called this the rafting diary. So after each rafting day, people would report on the emotions that they experienced. Of course, they reported, how much awe on a scale from 0 to 10, right? And we also measured other emotions they might have experienced, right? Because you could feel all sorts of emotions when you're in the outdoors. Pride, maybe, at having summited a mountain or survived the rapids. Contentment, right? Taking a nap after a satisfying lunch. Or, amusement, gratitude, being with a group of people that you care about. So we assessed a bunch of different emotions. And then we tested which of these predicted these changes in our well-being measures. And the key finding I'll show you today is that awe was the strongest predictor of improvements in well-being 2 weeks after the rafting trip. And for the researchers in the crowd, when we included all of these in the model, awe was the only statistically significant predictor of these improvements in well-being. So kind of building out this case that awe helps us explain why being in nature is good for us. I'll quickly mention a follow-up study that we ran with college students. It would be kind of a shame if the only way to get these benefits was going out whitewater rafting. So we did a diary study of college students in their everyday lives, right? No big whitewater rafting trips. And we found that on days that they experienced more nature, they experienced more awe, and that predicted improvements in well-being after 2 weeks. And I'm going to just sort of breeze by this so we have time for everything today. But the takeaway from that study was that, even these kind of everyday experiences of awe that we have, noticing a sunset or how the sun is sort of filtering through the trees, those can be beneficial for us, as well as sort of these big, whitewater rafting trips or experiences in nature that probably happen less frequently. So we have shown that in terms of takeaways, nature experiences are a common and powerful way that people experience awe in their own lives. And we saw that the awe they experience in nature helps predict, improvements that we have in our well-being and resilience as a result of these nature experiences. And as I mentioned, we found this effect consistently in both whitewater rafting and in people's everyday lives. All right, next up, I wanted to quickly show you evidence of the contagiousness of emotions. And I have to go quickly here. I know I'm running out of time. So I'll remind you, we had those GoPros, right? Suction cup to the front of the raft, looking back. We did what's called behavioral coding. I had a dedicated group of students look through that footage and quantify, people's emotional expressions, what they were expressing with their face and their voice and their body posture. We coded over 1,300 expressions of emotion of awe, pride, amusement, and fear. Those were the most common emotions we saw when people were going through the rapids. Now, one finding we found was that kind of what people were telling us in the surveys, the emotions that they experienced, we saw that reflected in physiology and also in their expressive behavior. That's always nice to see. But the impressive finding was that the extent that people vocalized and expressed their emotions affected the subjective experience and even the physiology of the people that were in the raft with them. So we found that people in the same raft had a 20 to 25% more similar emotional experience at the subjective, the behavioral, so in their expressions, and at the physiological level. So really sort of impressive evidence for the contagiousness of emotions. And so I'll wrap it up with some implications here. So given that awe during nature experiences improves the well-being and resilience of individuals, and that emotions are highly contagious, I think that this work together makes the case for collective experiences of awe and how that might be an effective way to improve the resilience of teams. While, some of us may think of, being out in nature is a way to get away from people, be by ourselves. I think this is an exciting idea that we can, reach out to people, invite them to go into nature with us, right? If we know people that are struggling, don't tell them to take a hike, right? Take them on a hike. So I think that, awe is an emotion that helps us, bind into collectives and into groups. And doing nature recreation as groups, I think is a way that we can capitalize on that. And awe is a great emotion, but so is gratitude. There are a lot of people that were involved in this project to help make it possible. I won't list them all here, but I always like hearing from people. So please feel free to reach out to me if you want to chat about awe or being in the outdoors. And I'd love to turn it over to our panel and start some Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Craig. That's fantastic. I don't know if you had an ability to take a look at the chat box, but people really enjoyed your presentation, especially that line at the end there. I liked it as well. Don't tell people to take a hike, take them on a hike. Good stuff. I like it. Let's jump, as you said, let's jump straight into our panel because we have two really brilliant men that are going to share their thoughts and insights. First, we're going to start with Tony Walker. And Tony is the Chief Executive Officer of Ambulance Victoria. He's also an associate professor, and he's got those initials after his name, if you looked on the website, ASM, because he's received a distinguished medal for all the incredible work that he's been doing over the course of his career. So, Tony, it's an absolute honor to have you here as part of this panel. I was hoping that maybe you can just share some of your thoughts on what you've heard today and maybe send a question to one of the gentlemen. Is that all right?
Absolutely, and a pleasure to be here. Good evening from Australia. Look, David, particularly, some really interesting things that came out from my perspective. I mean, as someone who's experienced awe, but never realised there was actually a science to it, that there was actually and that it can be measured. I found that quite interesting and quite amazing. And in fact, it's associated with overall well-being and happiness, and that I was really surprised by the variation in the sources. I think, like many people, I think I probably thought of the first picture you put up as awe-inspiring and the things that would do it. The fact that it's not necessarily rare I found quite interesting. And importantly, as you said, it can refill the well. And I think that's something all of us need to have something to be able to do. There were a couple of surprises that came out for me, David, in yours. I think one was around particularly you talked about your father, the fact that threats can actually be awe-inspiring. I've never thought of it that way before, and I think that was certainly interesting. And your opportunity you gave us to draw from our own experiences at work. I would never have thought that something I did as part of my work actually would be awe-inspiring, and the little mindfulness piece you did with us actually drew that out for me, and I found that really quite interesting. Certainly some opportunities to apply it to our profession, and I think the opportunity to educate people about it and to help them understand how they can do it. But I have a particular question for you, and I'm interested how you recommend that we put this into our daily life. I know a lot of us are practicing mindfulness and things like that, but what sort of tools or tricks could apply it into our normal life so that we normalize doing this every day?
Yeah, well, thanks for those reflections. In terms of how to apply this, I think one is vacations are important, and taking a break, and getting away into nature. I thought Craig's talk about emphasizing nature was really important. I think the quickest and easiest way to get a dose of awe is to just take a walk in nature, and I try to remind myself to do that. And I think we could all probably do a bit more of that. The second thing has to do with all of the opportunities that are available around us. Again, something I need to remind myself to to take advantage of more. We all have world-class museums within easy reach if we live in a city, and if not, there's generally museums or art shows or science talks available, if not in our towns, certainly on the internet. So just learning, I think is something that brings out a sense of awe in me, certainly. And then lastly, I think just noticing a bit more. And this could be natural features, on my way to work when I'm going over the bridge. It's actually a beautiful scene of the sun rising, and usually I'm stressed from commuting, but if I actually take a moment, take a breath and look, I think, wow, that's really something. And then lastly, I'll just say noticing what our colleagues do and our loved ones do around us, the kind of selfless service that our colleagues and loved ones do and that we can witness. And that is a kind of awe, I think. And it's one that maybe we just let pass by, whereas letting ourselves feel it and notice it, maybe communicate our appreciation, I think is one sort of neglected source of awe in everyday life.
Wonderful, thank you. It was again just amazing. As I said, something that I'd never thought that there would be an evidence base behind, and I think that will get a lot of particularly practitioners in health fields and others thinking about the fact that actually this is something that nature's not just good for you, as we heard Craig talk about, but it actually you can there's an evidence base of why it's good for you.
Yeah,
thank you,
great
Tony.
points, gentlemen. Thank you, Tony, for that, and David, thanks as well for the feedback on that. And the one quick thing I have on that as well is when you connect it with physical activity, right? In any workouts where it's great to do any, and I always remind people running on the treadmill, spot on, great stuff. But if you can, try to bring it outdoors. And if there's a local park, bring it outdoors so you're around the nature, as we heard. And that's like the cliche win-win. It's like the win-win-win-win. If there's a such thing, because there's so many benefits and it ties into so many different things. It's not just then it's physical health, and then that helps your mental health. And then if you bring somebody along, it's that social connectedness. And that's truly where it shows the interconnectedness of awe with resilience. And the other thing, Craig, that you had mentioned too at the very end when you mentioned the word gratitude, and I saw the Greater Good logo up there, and how they have the gratitude project that they're working on, and how I always say gratitude is hardcore resilience as well. And Tony, like you said, it's slowing down and taking those moments. But let's bring in Brad Norris, another great gentleman doing fantastic work. Brad's the managing director of Synergy Health. I first got connected with Brad with the incredible work that he's doing with New Zealand Police, with incredible people over there like Mel and her whole team. I know we don't have time for you to talk about that later. So at some point, Brad, please throw a link to something in there so people can see just the fantastic work, especially with the app and stuff that you're doing for first responders. It's something that more people should know about. But that's for another symposium, another day. What I want to ask you right now is, if you don't mind, maybe just your thoughts, your perspectives, and if you have a question for one of our panelists. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff. I echo Tony's comments about, it was almost quite surprising to understand there's so much research around awe, and particularly in nature. And I have to admit, I spend at least 3 or 4 days a week going up to the adventure park, the mountains, on my bike with my son, riding each week. And often I find myself careering down a hill, stopping and looking out over the sunset, and now I actually realise there's research in behind the benefits associated with that. So I certainly appreciate the value in doing that, and I know I'll even more appreciate those moments now, having listened to the speakers, both Craig and David. A couple of things that I was certainly surprised by was the longevity of the impact, in terms of, particularly, with your research, Craig, those moments and the longevity of the impact over a period of time. And one of the questions, and I saw it come up in the chat, but I'd also love to get your insights in a moment, is around that whole dose versus longevity of impact. I think that would be really interesting to explore in terms of, well, how frequently should we be getting those doses? Equally so, I understand the importance of taking those moments out of our normal day and looking for those moments of awe. I guess one of the experiences that we have and the people that we work with is when they often start experiencing some of those stress indicators, they often miss the early indicators and then don't recognise these challenges until they start experiencing those severe indicators like social withdrawal or essentially energy levels are low. And I think the challenge we have is giving people the insight in terms of ensuring they're consistently doing it, rather than waiting for that last moment when they're probably less motivated to go out into nature. So it's about obviously being very, very proactive as much as we can to incorporate those into our moments. I saw a number of people in the chat saying our workplace should do something. We should invest in our people going somewhere. But again, I think the challenge for us as people leaders is, how do we encourage people to take ownership of that? How do we ensure that people take that ability and understand the importance of, not only is it those holidays once a year or a few times a year, but how do we encourage them on an ongoing basis in order to prioritise this, when we know that well-being often isn't the key driver for most of the people we're interacting with on a day-to-day basis. Not saying it's not important to them, but ultimately I don't think people are prioritising it, especially when they start experiencing some of those more negative indicators. So a couple of questions for you, Craig. One, certainly that dose versus impact, whether there's been any insight around that. Also, love for you to confirm the number of people in that study. I noticed someone asked that question. I think there was 124, but correct me if I'm wrong on that. And also, I'm also interested if you're aware of any organisations that are scheduling in moments of awe as part of their wellbeing strategy, particularly in nature. Great.
All right, thanks, Brad. Yeah, we'll start with the easy stuff first. So yeah, in the papers, 120 in the published paper. I think in total, we had 180 over 3 years, right? So that was all of the trips. I think 16 trips total. I personally went on 12 of them. But we had to pilot our procedures, make sure things were working. The whole GoPro thing, like we tried them on helmets first, we tried them on oars. So we had to fine tune all of that, which is why not all of those participants made it into the papers. Now, the question of dose is really important I don't think anyone has looked at it, in a systematic way with right, a randomly controlled trial, which is really the gold standard for establishing this sort of things. So really the best we can do is kind of look at studies like mine, these experiences in nature, and kind of extrapolate. So I think our best guess is that every 3 to 6 weeks, people should try to have a bigger awe experience in nature, right? Whitewater rafting trip, maybe a weekend camping trip. And of course, between those, we encourage them to have awe in their daily lives, right? And part of that is kind of a mindfulness quality. And I don't mean kind of sitting and meditating like a monk, but just sort of noticing what's going on, in yourself, maybe catching those early signs of stress, like you mentioned, but also, what's new and beautiful in the world around you. Even being stuck in quarantine, me and my family for a year, there are things that you can notice if you pay attention that you can find really awe-inspiring. Maybe, watching your young toddler grow up a little bit over that time. And then the final question are there any organizations that have sort of implemented this? I think we're making incremental progress. So there's kind of a loosely affiliated group here in the US called Park Prescriptions. So these are doctors, MDs, who are sort of on board with the idea, like, we should be able to, tell people, hey, I prescribe you, a 3-day camping trip, once a month. Now, I don't think there's any sort of systematic funding or support for this, but, just connecting people who are on board with this idea, I think is really important. And one doctor in particular, Nushin Razani, is in the Bay Area. She's an MD who works with kids. So she's been also doing this work, getting kids plugged into the outdoors as a way to sort of buffer them against, early life adversity. So it's not scaled up like I would want it to be. I mean, the dream is, you can get a prescription and, use a copay to buy hiking boots or a tent or something, and have, make it easier for people to access public lands. But I think we're making progress in that direction.